One of my favorite things in the world to do is watch Friends. I know it's been off for years and years. It's not even around, but I still find myself binge watching old episodes. And I was thinking about this today and thinking, it's the predictability of the friends in the circle, right? You have Chandler with his quirkiness, Monica with her type A of just everything has to be so neat and tidy and organized. It's Phoebe's ability to make you laugh at her silly songs. Ross always comes in with those smart comments, and Joey and him and his food, like it is just so hilarious. And of course, Rachel, she just brings everybody together, and it's just such this beautiful, cohesive team of people. And it's why I wanted to come on and share with you today that I have an opportunity for you to find your friends in the content creation space. So if you are thinking about creating your first or your next digital course, I don't want you to miss this opportunity because OMME Porterfield just opened the doors for registration for her Course Confident Bootcamp. And I'm actually offering a special bonus for anyone that registers for the Course Confident Bootcamp through my special link. So I want you to go to crystalprofit.com/OMME-bootcamp to register. That's crystalprofit.com/OMME-bootcamp. And what you're going to find when you get there is I have this special bonus private podcast series. It's called Money Mindset for Creators. So I want you to go register for Amy's Bootcamp, download the podcast, and immediately start listening to it, because what this training is set up to do is to help you get your mind right about monetizing your content, making money so that you can fuel your content creation dreams. So go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp to register for Course Confident. And I cannot wait for you to find your friends and find the people that will be there for you. Do you see what I did there? Yeah, nice little friends segue connection. Go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp. And I cannot wait to see you inside. Okay, let's get into today's episode. I want to have a podcast just like OMME Porterfield's. Or I want to be a guest on Online Marketing Made Easy, the podcast by OMME Porterfield. Do you know how many times I hear this on a monthly basis? Like, I'm not exaggerating. I hear either one of these sentences about 10 times a month, probably more than that. I have people that come to me as a podcaster and they say, can you just show me how to have a podcast like OMME Porterfield's podcast? Or can you tell me how to get on OMME Porterfield's podcast? Like, no lie. You're probably smiling and nodding right now because you're like, oh, I've said that to myself. Or Crystal's talking about me. I have messaged her and said that to her. You know who you are. I'm not naming names, but you know who you are. And I've had this said to me so many times over the years that I thought, you know what? Why don't we do a case study on OMME Porterfield's podcast for Online Marketing Made Easy? So that's what we're going into today. Like, I'm totally going to nerd out and I'm going to go on a deep dive behind the scenes of Amy's podcast and kind of analyze a little bit of what her journey has looked like from an outsider's perspective, right? Like, I would love to have had Amy on the show today and really pour into all the questions that y'all ask me on a regular basis. So Amy, if you're listening, just know I'm going to reach out to you and ask you that we would love to have you back on the show so we can talk about your podcast journey and just totally geek out about it. But today is just going to be on observation and the things that I've learned from listening to her show for a long time, but also I'm asking the questions that I know you want the answers to. So buckle up, get ready, because we are going to go on a deep dive on the Online Marketing Made Easy podcast. So let's get right to it. Welcome to the Profit Podcast, where we teach entrepreneurs how to start, launch, and market their podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Profit, and I'm so excited that you're here. Thanks for hanging out with me today, because if you've been trying to figure out the world of podcasting, think of this show as the time-saving shortcut you've been looking for. So let's get right to it, shall we? Okay, so I am just totally, I've already warned you, I'm going to geek out on today's episode. I'm going to nerd out, and I'm going to be really transparent and tell you I went on an Instagram deep dive. Yes, I literally went back to Amy's very first post on Instagram from 2012. This is almost a decade that I went back, and I was looking for all of the different clues of the things that you assume about Amy's show that I wanted to really shed some light on. And so if you're brand new around here or you have never heard of Amy Porterfield, she is one of my virtual mentors who I have been so fortunate to have on this podcast, as well as meet in real life several times. And I love what she does. And I also used her show, like all the things that she does on there. We're going to talk about the specific ways that I used her show, but it was kind of the template that I held up as the gold standard for how I wanted my show to be. And it's why you see a lot of the similarities of there's a few similarities, right? I mean, obviously her show is very different than mine as far as context and speakers and reach and all those things. But I looked at so many things on her podcast, Online Marketing Made Easy, whenever I was getting started on my journey. And it's been so fun to go on a deep dive to see, well, how did she do things from the beginning? Yes, I went back to episode 1. If you follow me on Good Pods, this is my favorite podcast listening app that I use almost every single day. It's kind of like a social media platform for podcasting. And I listen to all my podcasts there, and you can go and like and rate and review podcast. It's so fun. So if you're not following me on Good Pods, come hang out with me, because that's where I listen to all my podcasts. If you've ever wondered, what does Crystal listen to? It's legitimately where I listen to it. But I put a comment on the episode that I listened to. It was Amy's very first episode. And I was like, hey, by the way, I'm doing this for research, because I'm sure some people were like, why is she listening to this episode? Because it's almost 10 years old. So let's get into all the things. But I wanted to tell you, like, I did my due diligence. I did the research for today's episode for our case study. So first and foremost, I wanted to tell you, I listen to Amy's podcast. I started in 2017. So I haven't been listening to her since the very first episode. I didn't even know who she was. In 2013, I was still in my corporate job. But she launched the Online Marketing Made Easy podcast on January 17th, 2013. Now, I give you that date because so many people, again, come to me and say, I want an Amy Porterfield podcast. I want exactly what she's doing. And I'm like, well, let's just be real. She's been at this for 10 years. And that's why she has the podcast that she does. It's why she has the reputation that she has. It's because she's been doing this for a very long time. And so I just wanted to throw that out there. It's like, I've only been listening to her for about, we'll just call it 4 years, right? At this point, I've been listening to her for about 4 years, her podcast pretty consistently. And even in the last few years, I've noticed some changes that we're going to talk about. But really, and I'm going to go through some very specific details that I found, and then I'm going to give you some takeaways that have kind of come from this little deep dive that I did. But the biggest thing that I want you to concentrate on is the fact that what you see today for her podcast is not how she started. And I wanted to make that very clear, because there is an evolution of her show. And even though it's incredibly successful and it's gone on to do some amazing things, like she's even part of a network, we're going to talk about that, don't worry. But it's just been really cool to go back in time and see that there were some ups and downs, and there were some pivots and turns, and the way that she started isn't what she has done today. And I hope that you find that encouraging no matter where you are in your podcast journey, because a lot of people get stuck in their head thinking, well, if I start it this way today, I can't change anything in the future. And that's just not true. If you've listened to this podcast for any amount of time, you'll notice that things are very different today than they were in episode 20 or episode 47. Like things are very, very different. So just keep that in the back of your mind as you continue to grow and podcast and figure out your own style of how you want to run your show. All right, so let's dive into some of the other stats and numbers that I have on Amy's podcast. So like I said, she launched her podcast January 17th, 2013. And here are a few things that I learned from listening to her very first podcast episode. I have to tell you, even though Amy is such an incredible speaker today, I can hear, like audibly hear, the confidence in her voice on the episode that she recently put out versus her very first episode. And I point that out because if you're listening to this right now and you've been struggling with maybe not sounding like yourself, or you're a little nervous, or you can listen back and you're like, oh my gosh, like, is that really my voice? Is that my sound? Amy's voice sounds very different in 2021 than it did in 2013. And I think that that's just confidence. I can imagine, and again, this is just my assumption into what was going on in her mind in 2013 is she was getting started. She was doing something new, something she had never done before. And to be really frank, something that was probably like, I don't even know how this is going to pay out, right? Is this really going to work out for me in the long run? There wasn't a Joe Rogan example of somebody making millions of dollars off their podcast. It was still a pretty small market there. Whenever I got started in 2018, just a few years ago, there were only 500,000 podcasts. I don't even know how many there were 5 years before that. There could have only been maybe 10,000 podcasts. I'm not sure, but I think that it's really interesting to audibly hear the difference in her voice in 2013 versus today. So that was something that I noted. Another thing, the actual length of her episode hasn't changed too much over time. And I say that because her very first episode was a solo, and then her next one was an interview. And then it kind of went a little back and forth over the next several hundred episodes of having a solo episode versus having an interview. And I just want to reiterate, I've said this before, but I think that having a mixture show where you have solo and interview is a really good call for those of you that don't want to worry about other people's schedules all the time, right? If you're like, I just have an interview only podcast and it stresses me out when someone cancels, well, maybe consider throwing in a few solo episodes. And for you solo episode podcast, I encourage you to try out an interview every once in a while. You could do it as a bonus episode to see how that's going to work for you. But I think that it's been pretty cool to see how things haven't shifted dramatically for her show. It's not like she was posting Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Monday through Friday, and then she decided to switch things up. That's not really what I have found, but that was just pretty much a quick skim over the episodes. Like I was scrolling through Good Pods and looking at all her previous episodes. So I think that first one was around 35 to 40 minutes in length. This was interesting. And I noticed, I think that she changed this around 2018, 2019, but she used to have a voiceover. So this is really interesting. So she had a voiceover introduction that was somebody else. It was a man's voice, and it was like, welcome to the Online Marketing Made Easy podcast, a podcast, and then like it went into her whole spiel of what her podcast is all about. And I remember thinking, oh, that's interesting whenever I first started listening to her podcast, but I didn't really think anything of it because I was new to her show. So I thought, oh, okay, this is probably how she does it. But then when she changed it, and now she hasn't had that for a few years now, going back and listening to that podcast, I was like, oh my gosh, I totally forgot that she had a voiceover introduction at the very beginning and at the very end. So this goes back to, even if you start your show one way, you don't have to stick with it forever. And I don't know Amy's personal choices for taking this away, but as a longtime listener of her show, I'm glad that she made the changes because it feels more like Amy, what she does for her podcast today. It feels more authentic to her brand and who she is, because it's a little jarring. And this goes for all podcasts. Like, especially if you're listening to a podcast and there's an ad that's inserted and it's not read by the host, right? It's someone else's. It's like a Geico ad or something else you're like, wait, did you look down at your phone and you're like, did something just skip? Did I move to a different podcast? Because it's jarring. It's almost like you're on the phone with someone and somebody's talking and then there's another voice that comes on. You're like, wait, oh my gosh, y'all, I totally just flashed back. y'all are going to laugh at me. You remember those days though, when you're at your house and you have multiple cord phones in your house and you're talking to someone and then all of a sudden your dad gets on the phone and starts dialing and starts talking. It's like, wait, hang on. Is someone on the phone? Is somebody there? And then if you're like me and you weren't supposed to be on the phone, it's probably late. And then you hang up real fast and you're like, was somebody on? No, that wasn't me. That wasn't me, Dad. I promise. I was asleep. I shouldn't have been on the phone. Was that just me? No, I know it wasn't. There's somebody laughing right now saying, I know exactly what you're talking about. But that's kind of what it is. It's jarring when you're listening to something and then it's someone else's voice. So I like the fact that she doesn't have that anymore. But it was just funny to go back and listen to it, because I had this memory that came up. It's like, oh my gosh, yeah, she did. She used to have a voiceover in her podcast. Okay, one of the other things that I noticed, so I didn't just listen to her podcast. I actually went to her website and went to the show notes for her podcast. Okay, y'all listen up, because this is one of the things that people ask me about so much, and that is, how should I do my show notes for my podcast? And I've talked about this many times. I have a very different definition than what some people do when it comes to their show notes, because what you see on your phone or whatever device you're actually listening, that is the episode description. That is not what I consider show notes. Okay? This is a very clear distinction that I have made from the beginning of my podcast coaching journey, is that is your episode description, what someone sees on whatever device they're playing your podcast from. What I consider to be show notes are what lives independently on a website. And I really do get that from following Amy's podcast for a long time and having these additional resources or different things that she's driving traffic to, right? She's like, hey, go to the show notes, amyporterfield.com/whatever. And that's where you'll find a link to this thing, or go learn more about my guest. Like, I learned that from her, but I'm also so appreciative because that simple tool has allowed me to grow my email list, promote products, have specific calls to action that really move the needle for my show. So I was like, oh, I got to go back to her very first episode to see, has there been an evolution from her very first show note that she ever put out to what she does today? And yes, there has been a very, very big evolution. So what I learned, and I'm going to link to all this in the show notes of this podcast, which is crystalprofit.com/episode 317. That's where I have some screenshots that you're going to find there from Amy's Instagram and some other things that I think, links that I think you're going to find helpful, including the link to her very first podcast episode. And the reason why I bring this up is because the actual URL for her very first podcast episode is important, and I'm going to geek out on you for a second. But I'm already geeking out on you. I'm going to go a little bit even geekier, a little bit deeper for you. And that is because the URL, I'm going to read it to you, so bear with me for a second. It's amyporterfield.com/1. That's what you could put. That's what I put, because that's how she numbers her episodes today. So I was like, I wonder if that's how she does it. That will take you to this URL. But what the actual permalink URL is amyporterfield.com/2013/01/ list building with social media. And the reason why I bring this up as interesting is because I can tell that her show notes for her podcast were very heavily reliant on keywords, SEO, and treating these show notes like they were a blog. And I say that because I can just tell the difference. Y'all know this. Y'all know that I took a blogging course in like 2017. And that was like my first introduction to online business. So I learned a lot of these things back in the day. But I just found it interesting because that's not what she does today. And I think that's simply because she has the domain authority, like Google recognizes her as someone, like she talks about this, she's going to rank higher because she's had who knows how long she's had her website. I don't even know how long she's had her own domain. I'm guessing at least 10 to 12 years because she's been in business for a long time. So she has the domain authority. So maybe she doesn't have to put all this extra stuff at the URL. But I found it interesting, and I thought maybe you would as well if you've been struggling like, oh, I want to do show notes for my podcast, but I don't know what to name it. Should it be the title of each episode? Should it be this? Should it be that? I'm going to do, like, this is a little aside. What I would recommend is creating show notes, your show note URL, making it something that you can say easily and that your listeners will actually be able to go to. So that's why I believe Amy does amyporterfield.com/whatever number. And that's why I do crystalprofit.com/episode 317, because it's easy for me to say, and it's not that hard for someone if they're listening and they're like, wait, what episode was that? Oh, I want to go. And you just know now, whatever episode number that you're trying to find for this podcast, you can literally put in crystalprofit.com/episode, whatever number it is that you're looking for. So I wanted to point that out because it was really just kind of interesting to me. Maybe it was a little too dorky for you. Maybe you skipped the last few minutes of this. That's okay. It's not going to hurt my feelings. Either way, because I told y'all, I warned you from the very beginning, I was going to geek out on all the things. But okay, the last thing I want to tell you about her show notes is how detailed they were in 2013 versus what they are today. And I'm going to link to her very first episode, and I'm also going to link to her latest episode as of me recording this podcast today. All right? Because her very first one has pictures and videos and multiple links, and it was a very long looking blog post. Whereas today, if you go to the show notes, they're still pretty detailed, but it's like probably a 500 word blog post style post. And her original one was probably 1,500 words. I'm exaggerating. I don't know exactly. I didn't count the words. I didn't do like a tool like, oh, word count. I didn't do any of that. But in just looking at it, it took me about 3 seconds to scroll her latest episode, and it took me a while to get to the bottom of her very first one. So that has been something that the style of her show notes has evolved over time. And so I just want to let y'all know, like whatever you're doing for your show notes, whether you're doing them or you're not doing them, just know that changing things in the future isn't a bad thing. It's not a deal breaker. If you don't have any right now, you can always make some in the future. But you also don't have to create these super, super long ones. You can make something that's shorter and it still be just as effective. So those are my notes on her very first episode. Now, like I said, I'm going to have a link to all of these in the show notes. But as of today, as of me recording this podcast, she has published 416 episodes. Whoa, right? That's a lot. That is a lot of podcast episodes. But it's also really interesting because let me go back because I took a few of these screenshots and I forgot to bring them up here. One of the things I wanted to tell you about is when it comes to, I went back to, like I said, the very bottom of her Instagram account, and I looked at, well, where does she talk about her podcast on Instagram? There wasn't a picture. There wasn't a single picture on her Instagram feed until November 2013.
Being a woman in business comes with its own unique set of challenges, but also so many opportunities. We get ahead by leaning in to what makes us different from business as usual. I'm Samantha Hartley, host of Profitable Joyful Consulting, inviting you to a special 6-episode series exploring the experience of being a woman in business. You want to hear from women consultants who've hit $1 million, who sell 6-figure engagements, or who've broken their own revenue ceilings? Yeah, those are my clients, and they'll be sharing too. Join me for 6 must-listen episodes that tackle key challenges for women consultants.
Follow Profitable Joyful Consulting on your favorite podcast app.
November. That's crazy, right? Because she launched in January 2013, but it wasn't until November that she started talking about her podcast on her Instagram. And I bring this up because I think, one, it's really interesting that she didn't have a launch plan. She didn't have this, she didn't have that, probably because it was 2013 and no one even thought to do a lot of these things that we do today. But also, I wanted to give you some hope if you're like, I don't have a big following. I don't know how to do social media with my podcast. I don't know this. I think that she wasn't as worried about that. I think that she was worried about delivering value. She was worried about maybe growing her podcast in other ways. Maybe she was doing a lot more list building. Maybe she was focused on something else. But I think that social media can often be a shiny object for podcasters. It's like, oh, I'll do this when my Instagram reaches 20,000 or 100,000 or whatever that looks like. But she went 11 months of podcasting without once talking about it on her Instagram. So that was just super interesting. I'm going to put a picture of this up in the show notes, but I thought that was so interesting. And then another thing, when I was scrolling, was in 2015. This is really cool. Her podcast was featured on the Inspiring Women's Voices of Apple Podcast. So that's super cool, right? So I guess this was like the new and noteworthy subcategory. So it wasn't just like, oh, you should check out all of these podcasts. It's like they were sorted by other different genres, or like, this is for women, or this is a woman that you need to listen to. So I thought that was really cool. So she had that to kind of help boost her podcast in 2015. And again, I have no idea what kind of bump that she got from this, but I thought that was really cool to see that her show was featured in 2015. And then another thing is I am part of her Momentum community. This is her membership community that is for her Digital Course Academy alumni. And she was sharing about a masterclass training that was all about podcast guesting, and it was so interesting. And she shared on there that Online Marketing Made Easy to date has had over 33 million podcast downloads. And I thought, wow, so inspirational, right? But again, that's 10 years in the making. Like I guess I can't say 10 years. That's 9 years officially. We'll be there in just a few months, but that's so inspiring. That's so inspiring. I haven't hit 1 million downloads. Like just to be clear, in case you didn't know that, I have not hit 1 million downloads. And so that's just super aspirational to see that in it, just all the work that she's done. It's so, I don't share that number other than I am just applauding her from afar and thinking, wow, that would be so incredible to say that my show has had 33 million downloads. So Amy, if you're listening, I applaud you. I'm congratulating you. That is super freaking awesome. And I hope you have a plaque hanging up somewhere in your office that says, I've hit 33 million downloads, because that's really cool. All right. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about is her recent update. So this was really, really interesting. I spoke with someone at Podcast Movement earlier this year, and they talked to me about Amy possibly joining the HubSpot network. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. I don't really know what that's all about, or, what will even come of that? What does that look like? And then she recently announced that Online Marketing Made Easy has joined the HubSpot network. Now, I'll do a whole other episode around podcast networks and how they work, but basically in a nutshell, this means that her show will be bundled with several other podcasts that are really big. I know Jenna Kutcher's Gold Digger podcast recently joined, as far as My First Million and Entrepreneurs on Fire. Like, there's a lot of big name podcasts that are already a part of the HubSpot network. But what they'll do is they'll take all of these shows that already get tons and tons of downloads, and they'll package them all together and present those to sponsors. Right? So when you say that you're a part of a network, you kind of batch like all of your numbers together. You put them in a collective, like metaphorical pot, and then you can present that to brands and sponsors and say, hey, we can offer up these podcasts that are, in front of you. Every single month, they get collectively however many downloads they get, and then they can price them out. And then I'm not sure how monetarily the relationship that Amy or these other podcasters have with HubSpot. I just know that is, in a nutshell, how a network works. I don't know if she's paid directly by them. I don't know if she gets a cut of ads that are on the HubSpot network, but I think that it's interesting, and it's something that I'm going to pay attention to over the coming months to see, well, does that mean that she has to have a little bit less creative control over her content, or does she still just get to create whatever she wants to create? Because prior to joining this HubSpot network, she's done whatever she's wanted to do, I'm assuming, right? This is all my pre-assumption on what Amy has created in the past. And I think it's really interesting. And I'm curious to see if other podcasters go this way in the future, because networks are starting to pop up all over the place. I'm starting to see more and more podcast artwork logos that have the studio studio name in the corner, or the network in the corner. You may have seen this on Stitcher Podcast, or Earwolf is another one for the office ladies. Like, these are just interesting podcast network choices that I've seen in the last few years. And I'll just keep nerding out on it and learn all the things that I want to learn about them and come back and bring them to you. But I just wanted to point that out as something interesting that I've seen recently on her podcast. Okay, we are going to wrap up today's episode with some of my biggest takeaways from doing this case study. So I wanted to give you a few words of wisdom and words of advice. And I've already kind of said it once here, but I wanted to tell you that you can't become an Amy Porterfield size podcast without doing the work. Okay? You can't just assume that you're going to start your podcast tomorrow and have 33 million downloads. All right. I wanted to make that really, really clear, because I feel like this is, people come to me and they say, I want to have a podcast just like Amy Porterfield. And I'm like, that's great. That's aspirational. Don't we all? But she's done the work. She's been doing this since 2013. 2013, way longer than I've been doing this. And I just think that it's really important to point that out. Is, yes, I think that it's great to have that as a goal. I think that that's super aspirational, and I think that it can be done, but it's not going to happen overnight. And I've been getting a lot of questions lately about people saying, well, somebody told me that podcasting isn't a quick thing. You have to be in it for the long haul. And I'm like, yeah, that was a smart person. Listen to them. They're absolutely right. And they kind of looked at me like, you mean that if I start this tomorrow, it's not going to make a lot of money? Probably not. Unless you already have hundreds of thousands of followers, your podcast probably won't be successful for maybe 6 months to a year. And they look at me like, well, why would anybody do that? Why would anyone do that? and I have to imagine, if I were to ask Amy, why do you do your podcast? It's probably a multitude of things, but I would imagine, having learned from her and listened to her content and consumed so many of the things that she's done since she's been in my world, I would imagine it's something to do with value. and connection and contributing something to the world that's bigger than yourself. Because that's what I see in what she does. I see how much she serves her audience and she shows up consistently. And I can bet you there's been some ups and downs and things that we'll probably never see that have happened behind the scenes. But at the end of the day, I think that one of my biggest takeaways is consistency. The girl has showed up consistently, right? Like, oh my gosh, since 2013. It just blows my mind that she's been podcasting that long. That was back when, like I said, I was still in my corporate days when she first started this podcast. So I just wanted to end with, if you've never listened to Amy's podcast, please go check it out. Online Marketing Made Easy. I'm going to have a link to it in the show notes, as well as a fun little evolution of pictures. I do have her podcast artwork, and I've put them on there. So if you've ever thought about, I don't know if I can change my podcast artwork, yes, you can. If Amy's done it, you can do it too. I've done it. If you want to rebrand, which Amy's never done that, I have. But yeah, go check out the show notes, crystalprofit.com/episode 317. But that's all I have for you today. So if you're brand new around here, make sure you hit the subscribe or follow button wherever you're listening to this podcast. And as always, remember, keep it up. We all have to start somewhere. Hey, Profit Podcast listeners. Thanks for sticking around to a little bit after the episode to hear this special message, because I want to hear from you. We are starting a new segment called Fan Mail Shoutouts, and I want to hear from you, and I want to hear your questions. What do you want to know? What questions have you been dying to ask me? So here's how to make this happen. Go to the app where you're listening to this podcast right now. Go there. I'll wait a second. Okay. Now, once you're there, you're going to see a hyperlink at the top of the episode description that says, send Crystal a text message. And that's all I want you to do. Send me a text. It could be casual, informal. It could be totally anonymous. Or if you want, you can include your name and the name of your podcast or content wherever you are creating, and I will give you a special shout out in an upcoming episode. So again, go to the show notes for where you're listening to this episode right now, and it will say, send Crystal a text message. And I cannot wait to hear from you and give you a shout out in an upcoming segment of Fan Mail Shoutouts.